Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we will discuss on global cybersecurity. We have our world famous speaker, Mr. David Schumacher, Mr. Rob, and Mr. Marshall. First, I would like to give chance Mr. David Schumacher.
Yeah, hello, Sharif. Global cybersecurity market. That's a huge and a rapidly expanding market, which I think you're going to hear probably a lot more about as some of the other people speak. I was looking at the market itself and not only looking at its size and expansion and its principal players, but I was thinking, how do people that are on this, that are watching in the audience, how do they become involved in this market? How do they make it personal to themselves? So three thoughts came to mind. The first one was investing, looking at the principal players, looking at maybe up and coming players, and looking where you can place your money. So I mentioned the principal players. From where I sit, Cisco, which I've been long familiar with, is the major player as I see it, along with Palo Alto Networks and Fortinet. So those are good places to start for investing. But as always, I think there's always an innovative approach that people can take, looking for uh, specific areas that aren't addressed in this broad cybersecurity market, niche markets, if you will. But probably the best way that your viewers can take advantage of this is if they're looking for a profession. If they are especially, say, coming out of university or maybe even just going into university, a profession in cybersecurity is something that has expanding horizons. I got into the computer business in its very, very early days and rode that wave and consider myself quite fortunate with what I was able to do with that. I see that being the same for those who get involved in cybersecurity. Now, what does it take to get involved in cybersecurity? Clearly, a good education helps. Computer science or information technology, associate's, bachelor's degree, those are things to strive for. But really, certification has always driven the computer markets, and as far as employment is concerned. And one of the uh, principal players in that has been for quite some time something called CompTIA. So I've been in the information technology space, and with CompTIA, their certifications start at a very general A plus, which teaches you basic computer hardware and software, and then on to things like Network Plus and Server Plus and other disciplines in the IT space. But CompTIA Security Plus certification is where you would want to go, looking for a good general fundamental piece of paper that says, I know what I'm doing with security. So if you back that up with education, and then the third step would be being able to get some type of experience. Some of that, which you'll get because at least the classes that I'm involved with, that I see at community college level, private school level, much of that is hands-on, and that can be uh, spoken about in the job interview as far as hands-on work. That's probably the next best thing to being able to put a job on your resume and getting that first job, having the education and certification are going to be principal in allowing you to participate in this rapidly growing market. So Security Plus helps you learn about threats, vulnerabilities, the governmental side, risk assessment, compliance when it comes to government and other governing bodies. And this is the place to get started. There are various jobs in cybersecurity. It's not one monolithic uh, type of industry, nor is it one monolithic type of job career path. So you can choose from those that are highly analytical, that require a lot of math skills. You can choose from those that require a lot of low level technical skills. And then there are administrative skills as well. So depending upon your particular background, if you're interested in getting involved and participating with this, there are different avenues that you can cut out for yourself. So take a look at the Security Plus certification at CompTIA, and then there are others as well, which I can go into later. But if you start looking at the certifications and what they will teach you and what you will be tested on, you can get an idea of whether that particular part of the cybersecurity market space, if you will, is where you want to go, and you can target your efforts. But I would advise people that are looking for something that's expansive and growing rapidly that they wish to get involved with, this might be their place. Thank you, Sharif.
Thank you, Mr. David Schumacher. Mr. Rob, what you want to add for this cyber security market?
Well, we're talking about the market. I won't be providing any investment advice. My insurance level isn't high enough to do that. But at least with regard to where the market is, and bringing us up to date, as we came out of the 1980s, most of the security work was kept very close to whatever the hardware was. IBM had RACF, and security was part and parcel to the platform that you were buying. It wasn't really a separate practice. Then Microsoft and Apple hit, and both companies took somewhat similar and somewhat different approaches to security. Apple did security by obscurity. They just decided they were going to lock everything down with regard to any kind of transparency with regard to security and keep it that way. So you never really knew how secure you were on the Apple platform. On the other hand, you didn't know how unsecure you were either. Microsoft just initially said security is somebody else's job. We're just not going to mess with that too much. And that was probably one of the biggest mistakes they made in the early years. As we got up through the 1990s, firms like McAfee and Symantec rose up, mostly focused on scripts, the ability to identify a piece of hostile code based on some unique identifier. And so they were mostly reactive. A piece of code would come out, some malware would come out, they would develop a script to identify it, they'd propagate the script to their customers, and people were somewhat protected from the scripts. Then we got into the 2000s and polymorphic viruses that could actually morph as they were being spread. So scripts stopped working, and then we started doing things like started to look a bit at behavior, but it was still new. Symantec started focusing on things other than security and lost its way. McAfee was acquired and then later sold by Intel and was severely crippled by the process. Not to mention their founder, McAfee, kept getting popped up in the news for various drug and murder-related charges, which didn't do their brand any good. Oh, on top of the fact that he did videos talking about how bad McAfee software was, which also didn't do the brand any good. I'm still surprised they kept the name and didn't rename themselves. And then the next generation of security technology was AI-based. Cylance, which is now owned by BlackBerry, is one implementation of that. Deep Instinct out of Israel is another implementation of that, and that's full behavioral monitoring. So that's where you're not that concerned about the code per se. You're concerned about what the code's doing, and so the behavioral monitoring allows you to not only look for malware that's doing bad things, but look for phishing attacks at people that are going in and doing things like escalation of privilege or stealing identities that allowed them to get access and do things that they really shouldn't. Snowden was probably one of the biggest implementations of where somebody had privileges they should not have had and was able to capture an awful lot of information and carry it out. He was a systems administrator with too many privileges. And so this idea of really looking at security holistically, looking at what privileges people had and what privileges systems had. One of the bigger breaches, which happened in Las Vegas, came in through a connected pump on one of the tanks on an aquarium, which was kind of interesting. And then a common attack vector was to come in, pound on a connected printer, and then spoof the printer. And then when the printer went offline and reset, you'd bring in your own virtual printer, but it wasn't a printer, and because nobody had set privileges for a printer, you had full access as a user, even though the network was seeing you as a printer. So matching the privileges to whatever the element was, whether it's a user and making sure they didn't access things they had no right to, or a piece of hardware, making sure it couldn't access anything that it wasn't supposed to be able to access, became a way to approach it. SIEM came up at that time, SIEM, which was a security monitoring capability that allowed you to see all the exposures you had in your enterprise. It was one of the least popular products that security came out with. And you think, well, why? Why wouldn't that be popular? The reason is because nobody had the bandwidth to fix the things that the SIEM products identified. And so all it did is point to how negligent IT was, without providing IT with any ability to fix those underlying problems. And so now that technology is advancing to a point where it can auto repair and auto fix the threats that it identifies. So it's advancing, and it's advancing to a large extent on an artificial intelligence vector. One new thing that recently came out is the concern about quantum decryption. And so IBM launched quantum safe cryptography, which allows you to develop keys, the things you use to access your encrypted information, that are quantum safe. Any key that is not quantum safe when a quantum computer becomes viable is believed to be compromised within a matter of seconds. And the concern here is that, say you're compromised, your encrypted data is stolen. It's encrypted strong enough so it can't be unencrypted. But they've got the data. But as soon as they've got quantum capability, then they can encrypt the data and do whatever the heck they want with it. And that's the attacker. And so quantum safe encryption is to develop keys that quantum computers struggle with cracking, and thus the stolen information remains safe, even if it's in the hands of somebody nefarious. The other thing that's really happened in security over the last decade or so is the entrance of state-level players at scale. We've always had state-level players that are acting in a hostile fashion, but it was kind of below the radar for the most part. Theft here, theft there. In fact, in most cases, state-level players focus pretty hard on making sure that you didn't know they'd stolen the information, so you didn't know you were compromised, and so you didn't mitigate the theft, which is the problem. For instance, if like anything else, if you could undo all the things that they found out about, or change them around significantly enough, the information, if they could get access to it, would be pretty much worthless because it would be out of date. But if you don't know it was stolen, then you don't make the mitigation efforts happen, and the end result is you remain exposed. One of the biggest breaches, and breaches now can happen over a period of months, if not years. One of the biggest breaches I ran into, which showcases another problem with stuff in this area, was never publicized. It was a large pharma company, and what happened is, over the course of a year, a hostile actor out of Eastern Europe went in and got all of the email addresses and rankings, titles for all the employees in the company, and then at the end of the year, they sent out a memo to every employee that wasn't in management, and told them the company had been sold and they needed to provide their banking information in order to assure their checks would go to the right place. Their final checks would go to the right place because the plant site was shutting down, and most of them were going to get laid off. And so that put people into a panic. They felt they need to get their information in. And by the time somebody thought to ask a manager whether this was going on, that Eastern European attacker had shut down its servers, taken the information, and was largely gone, with virtually every employee in that company now compromised, and identity theft vulnerable. By the way, identity theft, back when I did the studies on it in the early part of this century, cost about $250,000 in about 9 months of your time. So you do not want to have your identity stolen. Fixing it is incredibly costly, and it's probably about 3 times that today in terms of cost, about the same amount of time. And the way you fix identity theft is one of the most painful processes anybody's ever going to go through, because folks simply don't believe that you've had your identity stolen, your credit's trashed, you have a long dig out if that happens. So protecting your own identity becomes incredibly important. So in closing, as we get to this current age of artificial intelligence, you're increasingly going to see of security, cybersecurity. Artificial intelligence is playing a much stronger role, going in and starting to not only discover but to mitigate the problems that it finds, and stepping well away from scripts and the identification of malware by specific fingerprints, if you will, and going broadly to looking at behaviors and anything that's happening untoward in the cyber environment, and then flagging and moving forward. I expect what we're going to see in the next couple decades is the eventual merging of physical security and cybersecurity into a singular component of focus. The reason for that is often what we still find is companies can be very secure from a cybersecurity standpoint, but if they haven't brought up physical security, you can still see people getting in and getting access simply by getting hold of the hardware before it's been adequately logged out. And if the two systems don't talk to each other, then the electronic system doesn't know to immediately move to mitigation once a piece of hardware has been compromised, or if an employee has been terminated and the hardware has been turned in, at the same time, all access has to be terminated at the same time, otherwise they'll go in and do harm. An example of that, for instance, was a CIO a few years back who was fired over the phone by the CEO and was so upset and still had his privileges that he went back and deleted the company's operating information, basically putting the company out of business for a period of weeks, if not months, and doing millions of dollars worth of damage. He ended up in jail, but he clearly didn't have the resources to pay the damages. And so making sure these systems are integrated so that things happen. When you discover a problem, things happen across both domains becomes incredibly important. So going forward, largely an AI focus and an eventual merging of physical and cybersecurity efforts so that things that are supposed to happen in sync, and so that a physical threat can be corrected both physically and through the cyber environment as well as a cyber threat. You've got an employee that's acting out or acting hostile. You want to make sure they're physically blocked from the site as well as electronically blocked from the site, or you could have a mass shooter instance or some other security problem. So it's an interesting place to be. It does require fairly significant focus, and you can drift into this area from the physical security side or the cybersecurity side, and it can be a great deal of fun. I do recognize, though, when cybersecurity like storage gets exciting, something really bad has happened, and so if you like to live on the edge of excitement, this may not be where you want to be, because in cybersecurity, as in storage, when it gets exciting, it gets bad.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Marshall, what you want to add?
Well, I think that it's been a good conversation piece, and this session is very interesting, Sharif. Once again, you brought something that integrates a lot of different elements into it as a topic. And I think David has addressed the job opportunity and job security capability, and Rob has obviously outlined the whole approach to cybersecurity and how it integrates with AI. I was involved in it early on, back in the 90s, when the internet exploded, and we built our first website back in 1993, that is, not 1893, just to be clear. And and so what happened is that the propagation of people stealing information and theft has just graduated, as Rob has pointed out. As technology increases and gives us better opportunities, we have more opportunities for cybercrime and cybersecurity requirements. Classic example is Internet of Things. We have a lot of devices out there that are connected to the internet, especially in the developed world. I imagine it's coming to the developing world as well. And so, as Rob pointed out, if you're going to see an integration between the physical and the software components. Cybersecurity measures include firewalls, antivirus software, intrusion detection and prevention systems, and encryption. And maybe a very basic one that a lot of people forget about is when you log into something, you use your login credentials and your password. And one thing that still works to this day it's a simple fix, is constantly change your password. There are now software applications that can fit right on your smartphone that can help you create very sophisticated password protection. And some of it is attenuated to what Rob was talking about and what David was referring to in terms of job opportunity. People that get involved in this process have opportunities to get good paying jobs and at the same time help people protect themselves from cyber intrusions and attacks. And some of those attacks are known as Trojan horses. Everybody knows the myth of the Trojan horse from Greek mythology, where somebody implants something that thinks it's part of them, and then it turns out that it's got a bad actor in it. And of course, we mentioned phishing, and that's not with an F, that's a PH, PHISHING, phishing, where you actually send something out to somebody and they respond to it. That's known as phishing. And of course, denial of service attacks, DOS, where they simply prevent you from access. And that's a lot of those state actors out there. We've seen that in the Russian-Ukrainian war, a lot of DOS attacks, and also what are known as control system attacks. A lot of weapon systems are automated today, especially missiles. So if you can prevent their systems from firing properly or they implode on themselves, that's a method of disruption. Ooh, somebody's out there driving around. Anyway, so basically, those are some of the things from the world of cybersecurity. I can tell you that in my area, both I have three businesses. One is in marketing research, strategic marketing, and ad agency work. Cybersecurity is extremely important to protect the client's information and how to use it in an appropriate fashion. And since 2015, I guess, we've seen exponential rates of increase on ad agencies to acquire their information so that people can steal that information and use it to their advantage in the business world. In terms of the other business we're in, which is the climate restoration, climate repair business, it's extremely important that we use technology to our advantage that protects both the material that we're putting into our systems and the material that is produced by those systems. And for that purpose, predominantly we're using special type of blockchain technology combined with cybersecurity technology. And that's what's happening. And that's where some of the jobs that David is talking about. As we move forward and we create more joint ventures, we are going to be hiring more people to be able to monitor and manage that process. You need people. You always need people in the loop. You just can't rely on AI and robots themselves. It's always good to have a human interface and a human overlook over the technology, so that somebody has responsibility, and it also creates good paying jobs, Sharif. So that's my intake for this part.
Thank you, Mr. David Schumacher. As you say that the cybersecurity market create a lot of job opportunities. We are working with the youth communities in the developing world, so how they can get more opportunity in the international market.
Yeah, so that goes back to what I was talking about earlier. And briefly, just to recap, I think you really need three things to do anything in technology space. You need education, you need certification, and you need experience. So wherever they find themselves lacking in those three things, think of that as like a three-legged stool. When one leg is shorter than the other, you're not as stable, you're not as well prepared. So that would be the basic information that I would look at. Do they need to go to university? Maybe they've been to university, but they need to be able to prove to the employer the depth of their skills, and that's where certification comes along. And early on into new technologies, I find that certification actually can become more important than what you might think of as the fundamental educational component. That might seem strange, but in the early days of a new industry, things are changing so fast in that industry that the lag in the education aspect works to its detriment, where certification, especially if it's put out by vendors, can provide specific markers, if you will, of how much you know about a particular product or a particular uh, focus on the industry. So for right now, cloud computing, software as a service seem to be two big areas in this as far as I see what's going on. So certifications in those areas can be very, very beneficial. But if you're just getting started, I go back to the basics, and that would be like the CompTIA certifications. Those are very good for somebody that's first starting out, an excellent place to get started. I hope that brings some clarity to your question, Sharif.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Rob, what is your advice for the youth community that how can they get more opportunity for getting job and even doing entrepreneurship initiative?
Well, David's right with regard to certifications, and security certifications are kind of king. It's degrees are less important. The certifications point out that you have capabilities in certain targeted areas and will get you in. The advancement in security in a company leads, well, typically on two paths. You've got a physical security path, which of course is right now mostly not computer related, and then you've got the electronic security path that takes you up through the chief security officer of the firm. One of the big problems right now, though, with chief security officers, is often they don't have authority over the hardware or software the company is purchasing, and while they can provide input, at least what we found is they have no ability to assure that input has been followed or the rules adhered to, and an awful lot of breaches are occurring because the security organization is decoupled from the buying and validation process of new products. David also pointed out that we're in the midst of a major pivot to a cloud computing environment from an on-premise environment. Much of what we're dealing with right now is called hybrid, which is a blend of the two. The security problems in a hybrid environment are somewhat exacerbated because you still have all the site security problems that you typically would have, but you also have to make sure that you protected yourself with the cloud provider, and that different cloud providers have had varying degrees of breaches over time. They are reasonably secure, but they're also incredibly attractive. It's like having a huge bank with much of the world's money in it. They can be real secure, but everybody and their brother's trying to break into the place. So security then becomes relative because of the level of threat they experience. Also, be aware that one of the recurring problems that occurs in this industry is fixing one problem and by so doing creating another one. Example would be a few years back, the U.S. government, I believe it was under the Obama administration, came up with a brilliant idea of let's network all the nuclear power plants together. Up until that particular point in time, the nuclear power plants were air-gapped. You couldn't get to them from the internet. It didn't matter if you had approvals or anything else. They were fully air-gapped. And one of the most secure things you can do to a connected piece of equipment or an infrastructure is to take it off the web. If you're disconnected, that means somebody has to go on site to compromise it. And given a lot of the software that's used in these power plants, whether nuclear or otherwise, is real old and so fairly vulnerable. But the government's argument to connect these things was so that if a breach occurred, they would be more able to discover what the breach was and spread the remediation to the other sites before they were hit. But that showcases, at least to me, wrong-headed thinking, because the sites themselves were vulnerable and protected by air gaps. Eliminating the air gap opened them to a level of exposure where all the plants could get hit at once. You wouldn't have a cascade. You simply have one plant getting compromised could spread whatever the malware was to the other plants, because once they're connected, now the malware can flow through that connection. One of the biggest security tests that taught me this lesson about the vulnerability of connections was done by IBM. I think it was in the late 80s, early 90s. We had built a site that we felt was ultimately secure, that was impenetrable. And then we hired an ex-CIA guy, a spook, to penetrate it. He was in within a matter of hours. And he didn't even try to penetrate the site that we created. He looked for trusted sites that the site was connected to, found one that was unsecure, penetrated it, and use the trusted link to bypass security and breach the site. So it doesn't matter how secure your site is. If you've got partners, customers, or other players, or remote employees, for instance, that have access and then can penetrate security to do their job, if they can be penetrated and compromised, it makes a pipe right through your security into your environment. This also points to another change in security that's occurred. It used to be we would think of security kind of like a wall, like you'd have a wall around a castle, and you'd make that wall impermeable. That worked reasonably well until we had the internet and it started drilling holes through the wall, and we drilled lots of holes through the wall. And we created something called VPNs, virtual private networks, that allowed for remote actors, employees, executives, partners, to drill through security, and even if they were remote, act as if they were on premise. Really brilliant idea, except when you think about it, that just means that an attacker no longer has to go to the site to penetrate something. They can do it from any place in the world. All they've got to do is get access to that VPN, and they're in and out, and you'll never find them again, since they're probably doing it out of Asia or Eastern Europe. So the end is looking at security from a holistic standpoint and making sure that when you're doing something to fix one problem, you're not destroying another. One of the other issues in security to monitor is the underreporting. I mentioned that site that was breached and it was never reported publicly. There have been laws put in place for where our reporting is required. Those laws are not followed aggressively at all. The group that was missioned to make sure laws like that were followed, both in and outside the government, internal audit outside the government, the various enforcement agencies inside the government, are all underfunded, and the end result is we do not have the level of oversight either from government, talking about the U.S. Government, or internally in companies anymore to really prevent people from flaunting the rules and doing things that are foolish. And the other experience of that over the years is, for whatever reason, executives often feel that rules don't apply to them, which is why spear phishing has become very popular, going after the executives and then using their excessive privileges to do harm has been common. And because the executive has a great deal of power to cover up the problem, a lot of those breaches are not reported because they would reflect badly on the board and the executives. I figure there's going to be, at some point, there's going to be a tell-all about all this stuff, and I hope I'm far away from that when it happens. When you want to get into this area, there are a number of ways to get in. Obviously, you need to get into computer science. This is heavy math stuff, and you've got white and black hat players in here, and both as long as you're not doing something criminal, both approaches can be incredibly attractive and lucrative. Black hat players, legal ones, often work for the government or work for security firms who are actively looking to find or create breaches and then create fixes of the breaches that they can market to the environment. The black hat activities in security firms do raise concerns with the buying public, because there's this constant belief that maybe the security firms are creating breaches fundamentally so they can sell software. But at least the U.S. domestic companies, for the most part, seem to have their ethics in line. I worry about a lot of security firms out of Eastern Europe who appear to be more about breaching things instead of about fixing the breaches. But that's as it is. Personally, I would say mostly on the white hat side, as long as you're not doing bad stuff, even if you're doing it with the blessings of the government and the company, there's less chance somebody's going to blame you for doing harm. And recognize that if you're doing that black hat stuff, you generally are guilty until proven innocent, and it's very hard to prove you didn't do something. It's much easier to prove that you did. So the playing on the white hat side, which is mostly focused on sealing breaches, not creating breaches, you'll be in better shape. The only caveat to that would be internal audit. Internal audit, typically in a well-staffed and funded internal audit team, you will have people that will look at, and I did when I was doing security for IBM, looking actively for breaches, though you don't, and you may actually do the breach yourself. I got access to stuff I had no right to see a number of times because security wasn't tight enough. But you have to do that to show that the exposure is real and to be able to highlight the kind of damage the exposure would cause, so that you motivate the fix of the problem. Otherwise, management in any company will lower the priority and the problem won't get fixed. So it's an interesting area. As I mentioned before, it can be somewhat stressful. You couldn't pay me enough to be a CSO, because that's where the blame typically resides. There are certain jobs that are blame magnets. Risk managers, CSOs, CIOs, and CMOs. Excuse me, CFOs are all folks that collect blame. CMOs have a whole different kind of problem that we won't call talk about in this call. But but there are certain jobs you want to look at pretty hard if you're going to move up to it. The CSO job is one that is incredibly stressful, where you often aren't given the authority you need to fix the problem, but the problem will fall on your desk regardless. And having a job where you can get blamed for a problem that you're not allowed to fix is not my idea of a good time. So I would look at the security practices up through investigation, but a CSO, I would stay away from that job like the plague. And best of luck. This is an area that can be an awful lot of fun, though, and it's an area that the governments are staffing and funding to a very high degree, and they can't get enough people. So often, if you get a good portfolio of certificates and an appropriate computing degree, you can almost write your own ticket. Even in a government job, and that can make it incredibly lucrative. Be aware, though, in many cases you can't talk about that job or what you're doing in the job to your family or friends. So if you've got the habit of chatting what you're doing at work, this is not a career path for you. It will absolutely end badly. So you're looking for a lot of stuff that's heads down. You may have a group of friends you work with that you can chat with. But your external friends and your marriage are going to take a hit if you delve into this area very deeply, particularly on the government side. So just be aware of some of the downsides. But it is a great career choice, and if you get the right credentials, it's a very lucrative career choice as well.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Mr. Marshall, what is your advice for the youth?
Well, I think both David and Rob have pretty much covered the bases. There's a lot, as they said, there's a lot of integrated areas, everything from critical infrastructure security. There's opportunities there in the job market, application security, network security. These are all known. Cloud security that were brought up. And what I brought up earlier on is Internet of Things security. All of them are areas that are beginning to integrate, as both Rob and David have pointed out. And I would suggest that if people want to get an opportunity in this area, they just follow what Rob and David are talking about and how to get the kind of certificates they need to acquire. And of course, experience helps, but right now, getting a good education in computers and also a background in. And I also recommend going back to the fundamentals of security. A lot of people are unaware of the fact that the basic internet language is not HTML. A lot of people think that's what it is. That's hypertext markup language. The actual code, basic code of the internet is bind, B-I-N-D. That's the acronym. And there are several, in North America, there are 7 bind servers. In South America, there are 2. In Southeast Asia, Sharif, I think there was only one before. There might be 2. I think one of them is in Malaysia, by the way, based there. And these bind servers are the backbone of the internet. In fact, on 9/11, when the terrorists attacked New York, a lot of people are unaware of the fact that they attacked They tried to attack the 7 bind servers in the United States and North America and Canada. And Mexico, and they were able to take down 2. Our team, this was back in 2001, had created internet applications and websites for several banks who I can't mention because I'm under non-disclosure. But those banks were attacked, and our banking system at the time was the only bank systems that were not compromised by the taking down the bind servers, which was a very clever way of going about it. Go at the core, attack the bind servers, and you essentially take everything offline. And then when the terrorists attacked Washington and New York, their approach was to keep people out of the loop and try to take off the systems offline. And at that time, the bind servers were the way to go, and they were successful to a point. But we were a part of this was before Homeland Security was created at that time. We were part of 100 people participating in FBI and other programs that were on conference calls with 100 people at a time to determine who survived and who didn't. And they wanted to know why our software survived. At that time, there was a software known as Flash, which created websites, which was impenetrable because people hadn't tried to hack it. But today, anybody can hack anything. So you can hack Flash, you can hack anything. So everything is vulnerable. And that's why, to answer your question, Sharif, the future is here. It's here and now. People can go out and get really good jobs. And I kind of agree with Rob. Don't be on the black hat side if you can prevent it. Get on the white hat side because unless you love stress, it's a very stressful job, especially black hat, where you're trying to penetrate things so that you can try to fix them. It would be like trying to be a doctor and creating a disease so that you can try to prevent a virus that you can get an antivirus drug to prevent from it happening. So a lot of stress, a lot of responsibility, but I think it's a good opportunity for a lot of young people, especially people with good math skills. I think you need a good background in math. I developed that in my early years, and that's what helped me create these sites and went way beyond. And we always went to the core. So in 1993 to 2000, we were involved in creating websites for a lot of bank customers. And the good news is we were able to use software at the time that was appropriate. Since then, no longer appropriate. It's very hackable. So you got to come up with new solutions all the time. That creates new revenue opportunities, new job opportunities, and that's where we're at, Sharif. That's the way of the world. So I suggest everybody go out and change your passwords or get a password manager to help make sure that you stay safe out there. So Sharif, that's my take, and that's my concluding remarks because I do have to go to another meeting. I apologize.
Thank you, sir. Mr. David Schumacher, what is your concluding remarks for today's session?
Well, like so many things in the IT space, it's not an individual effort, it's a team effort to keep the whole IT structure running. My particular place in that for years was as a systems administrator. So when I first started, that was hardware servers, hardware networks. I worked with a network engineer that's part of the same team that I was on. And he was responsible for the network, where I and other system administrators were responsible for servers, storage, and so forth. As security became a bigger and bigger issue, some of those responsibilities that had been mine as a systems engineer migrated to other roles at the company. And at first I felt threatened by that. And then, as has been pointed out, the uh, stress to manage all of this when it's divided out across the team is much stronger than laying it on an individual. And over time, I began to appreciate the fact that there were others that were coming in and evaluating my system. So when I would build a new system, in the early days, I would manually go in and close down ports, and I would know where vulnerabilities were depending upon, is this a Unix system, Linux system, is this a Windows Server system? And there would be checklists that I would go through. But then security would come along as time went on, and they would go through and they would scan and then provide reports back to me for fixing. And then at the corporate level in larger companies, they would take this information and they would integrate it into new server installs so that when I would load a server for the first time, it would actually not be, as you might standard think of it if you're working with home computers. These servers would be laid down by a base layer operating system that's already pre-configured to lock many of these security holes and so forth. And then we would run each application for a server in its own individual environment. So this server only did one thing at a time. And then it would be then once again scanned by an external agency to see what potential problems there could be. But as time moved on, of course, nothing in IT stays the same. So my servers became virtualized. And what that means is that instead of having, say, 50 or 100 servers sitting in a rack, I might have 4 or 5 really huge capacity servers there that have virtualized servers all running in themselves. So what had been hardware now has become software. And then to take it a step further, the network that ties all those servers together is a virtualized network environment that goes out and touches the hardware network environment. That's the responsibility of my network engineer. So back to what I was saying earlier, I was very grateful that there were people that from my own company that could look from the inside, could scan for problems, could report the problems. And then if we found something that was systematic based on the nature of the software or the hardware, that then we could remediate that and lay that down then in a base image, whether it be for an individual server or for virtual servers or for virtual networks, to allow us to more rapidly and uniformly be able to mitigate these threats. But there's always threats coming in, and there's always more to do. So I was always happy in the end to be part of this team. And the team was systems administration. Where I was at was the security people that we've been talking about today, but then also computer engineering, their software developers, and the work that they're doing and how that interrelates to what's being run in the environment. So if you look at security, cybersecurity, and decide that's not right for you, there can be other places on this team that are still very much in demand and still very good job prospects. So it's broader than just the base subject that we were talking about, and it will continue to change as time moves on. I already talked about software as a service and cloud computing, how things have moved on to that, and who knows what's next. So if you like, always being presented with new challenges and always needing to learn something, well, this is a pretty good area for you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rob, what's your concluding remarks for today's session?
Sure. There is a danger for kids going into security. And that danger is it provides an attractive path to getting things you're not entitled to. And what I mean is it's not uncommon for kids studying cybersecurity in college or university to use those skills to try to get access to tests, to test scores, to do things that they shouldn't be doing at school. And there was a time in the past where somebody that was a kid went in and had a particularly creative hack and did some damage, they might actually end up getting a job. These days, you might just end up going to prison, and certainly you'll be expelled. The benefits tied to doing bad activity have, for the most part, evaporated. And just be aware that with a lot of kids, they don't develop the concept of repercussions until their mid to late 20s. That means that your temptations to do things with this technology that are bad are going to be high, and your ability to actually understand the risk that you're taking is going to be low. If you even consider doing something like this, or around anybody that are considering something like this, make a change. This is not something to fool around with. We have a level of detection capability that is far greater today than we had in the past. It's still not where it needs to be, but our ability to go through and find somebody that's done something inappropriate is currently unprecedented, largely because of the state of the world and the level of threat that we're dealing with state level actors. And no group of friends is going to be able to compete with a government funded agency in any country. So the repercussions can vary a great deal, but they're fairly severe, to the point where you could, as we saw with Snowden, you could end up living not being allowed to return to your country of origin after you're done, once you run, or if you don't run it's life-changing. And so this is an area where you want to early on recognize that if you're focused on doing the right thing and not taking shortcuts, then this could be a good career path for you. If you like taking shortcuts, if you like gaming the system, then it can be very dangerous, because if you do the wrong thing, the repercussions can be severe. So look into your heart here. If you're really focused on trying to make the world a better place, finding a great career for yourself, and advancing along a programmatic path, then security can be great. If you are not, then you may want to find a different career to go into, because this one could be deadly to your career and your future aspirations in the world. So it's like anything else. Cybersecurity has offensive and defensive capabilities. Until you really understand what the risks are, you don't want to mess with the offensive stuff, because you'll get into a lot of trouble. But otherwise, it's great. I actually started out in physical security myself. I drifted into cybersecurity much later in life, and the combination of skills actually did me a lot of good. It allowed me to do things as an internal auditor that others were not able to do, and allowed me to stand out and differentiate, which is very important in any job, and do so positively. So it's a great place to go. But knowledge is your friend. A lack of understanding of consequences is not. So just be very careful out there.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. From Malaysia and Singapore, actually, we are trying to develop more young resources through the cybersecurity training. So if you have good advice, good guidelines, or any of your project you want to share with our youth community in Malaysia, we are happy to work with you. And that is the way, actually, what we learn from this kind of open dialogue, we try to apply it in practical world. That is the way we actually try to develop this developing world. So hopefully through these cybersecurity discussions, our youth community can learn a lot of things. I request all of our audience, please share our content as much as possible. Thank you, Mr. David Schumacher, Mr. Rob, for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.